Hello YouTube, it's Ashlar here with the second in my series of beginner Java tutorials on random numbers. So if you didn't watch the tutorial before this one, I'll just quickly let you know where we're at with what's on the screen right now. If you would like further explanation, you can always go to the previous video, which was the first one on random numbers that I uploaded. So right now what we're looking at is we've got an import where you had to import java.util.random. I created a class that I called random numbers, and here is where we created a random number generator called numbers. That was a user-defined name, numbers. Everything else in this code you have to write in, but that can be whatever you like. Then we created a variable to store the value that the random number generator returned. So we created the variable x, and then what we did is this next line increments the value of x by 1. Before we output it to the screen with this code here. So that means that by incrementing the value of x by 1, we don't get the number 0, and we're actually, in this case, we have 500 as a range. It means that this number generator is going to select a random number between 1 and 500. So I'll just click that and show you right now. We got the number 218, and you can keep running. You'll get all kinds of numbers between 1 and 500. Okay, so now we've got this random number generator that's picking numbers between 1 and 500, and we're outputting a single number into the console. But what if you wanted to generate a list of random numbers rather than just one at a time and have to keep running the code? Well, fortunately, Java has loops built into it, and one really good way of running this code more than one time would be to use a for loop, which I will also explain in another tutorial, but for now you can just follow along and the code's going to work. So you type above the code that we already wrote, but after the random numbers, you're going to type for, and then in parentheses, oh actually, you know what, before we do that, we're going to leave that there because we're still going to create a for loop, but we have to create a couple other variables that we're going to use in our for loop. The first variable is going to be a counter. So int, because it's going to be an integer, and I'm naming it counter. Again, you can call these anything you like, but for now I'm using really descriptive names so that as you follow along with the code, it's a little more clear what everything does. As you become more experienced with Java programming, you may use shorter names or more abbreviations, but for right now I really want to make this as readable as possible, so I'm going to use a lot longer names for my variables. So we'll declare a variable called counter, and we also want to declare a variable called, let's say, we want to decide how many random numbers to generate. So we'll just call this how many numbers. So there we go. And actually what we'll do right now is we will give it a value so that later on we can change that and mess around with it. And then when we get into our third tutorial, we will be able to ask the user to decide how many numbers they want. So right now we're going to give it a value. Let's say we want to generate a list of 10 numbers. So this how many numbers is going to be 10. And again, both of these things I just created, counter and how many numbers, are just names that I chose. You could call this int y or int c, or you can call this how many num, or it could be just any name, but again I'm using descriptive names. So we've got counter and how many numbers, and that should be all we need for our for loop. So what we're going to do here is in parentheses we're going to say counter equals 0, because we're starting our counter at 0, and then it's going to count through basically until we get to how many numbers. So that's the first declaration, and then we need to say counter is less than how many numbers. So that means that while the number of counter is less than whatever the value of how many numbers is, so in this case it's going to mean less than 10. If this was 100, it would be less than 100. And then we're going to increment our counter. So we're going to do plus plus counter. Then we want to put curly brackets around the code that we had written in before. Okay, and you can see right there I've got an error after doing that. If you look at these little X's, that usually means there's something wrong with the code, and I see what it is. It's this, I put a regular colon there instead of a semicolon, and there we go, the error disappeared. So now we've assigned how many numbers to equal 10, and we've created a for loop. So this little curly bracket here and that one means that the code inside there, I'm going to actually format this a little more so you can see it a little better. So the code inside of the for loop is going to basically run 10 times. And I'll also put some spaces in here just so it's even a little more readable. So what this means is we've got a counter that starts counting at 0. And you could think of this counter as maybe a person who's saying, all right, I'm saying 0, and 0 is less than how many numbers, which is 10, and then we're going to increment the counter. So then we're going to run this code, and then because we incremented the counter's standing around and he's saying, okay, 1, and now 1 goes here, and 1 is still less than how many numbers, and we're going to increment the counter, and the code's going to run. And now the counter's saying 2, and so on and so forth. The counter keeps saying whatever that new number is, it's always going to be 1 more than the last time, and that's basically a way of counting to 10. Well, actually, it's counting to 9 because 0 through 9 is 10 total counts since we're starting at 0. You could also just say, counter equals 1 and then make this counter is less than or equal to how many numbers. But this is just a little less typing and a little more easy to understand. So you can see here that I'm going to hit run up here, and we're going to end up with a list down at the bottom. Well, I was so excited teaching you guys about making this loop that even though I explained it correctly, saying the counter needs to be less than how many numbers, I put the greater than sign in. And what's going to happen with that mistake I made is the code isn't going to run at all. And I just clicked run, and you can see we got a terminated program. The reason for that is that because counter is 0 and how many numbers is set at 10, counter is not greater than 10. 0 is not greater than 10, so therefore the code never runs, and it just basically terminates the program. So that little mistake I made there, even though it's valid code, we get a result where nothing runs. So let's go ahead and change that. So if you were following along with me and typed it exactly as I typed it and made the same mistake I did, just change this from a greater than to a less than. And now what we're going to get is we're going to get a counter that counts from 0 to 10, and the result is that this code is going to run 10 times, and each of the times it's going to pick X is going to be a number that's between 0 and 499, and then we're going to increment it, so we're going to end up with a number between 1 and 500 and print it out to the screen. That's going to happen 10 times, so we should end up with 10 numbers. And let's click run, and as well, you can't see yet. As you can see, we got 10 random numbers between 1 and 500. And you can run it again and get another collection of numbers and just keep running this all day and just really have a lot of fun. I know this is probably the most fun program that you've ever made, and you're going to want to really run this all the time because it's just so exciting seeing all these random numbers. All right, so now with that done, we can make a couple other quick changes to the code that we have on the screen just to kind of demonstrate a little bit more about adding different code to it. So as you can see here, this number 500, we defined the range of how many numbers it would choose from. But because this was something that we defined, we might also instead change it to a variable. And I'm just making this up, range, because that's essentially what it is how many numbers we're choosing from. And we can create the variable up here, int range, because remember, it's got to be an integer. Oh, we don't have to set it equal to anything right now. And the code now is valid. We've set range, and now whatever value we give this integer up here is what's going to get passed in. So we had 500, so we could just as easily say int range equals 500. And now the code is still going to run the same way it did before, but we just put a variable in there, which gives us a little bit more control over the program later on. For example, if we wanted to have the user define the range, which we'll probably do in the next tutorial, or if we just want to quickly change it and know what we're changing. Before you just had this number here and maybe you wouldn't remember that that is the range, so now we've kind of defined what it is and can set it up here instead. Another application of it is maybe we want the range itself to be a random number. So we could create a random number generator that generates a random number for this random number generator. So see how much fun we can have geeking out with this? So that's all the changes I want to make to the code in this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we're going to be actually modifying what we've written to be a dice roll and create more random number generators that'll be different kinds of dice. So we're going to take what we've already got on the screen and edit it. So if you're going to follow along, you can save this code or keep it on your screen until the next tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed what you learned today and understand everything. If you don't, leave me a comment. If you enjoyed it, leave me a comment. Subscribe to my channel, like the video, and stay tuned for more tutorials from Ashlar.